The candles were lying. That was the first thought Ellie had when she stepped into the grand ballroom of Ashenvale Castle, that the 1,000 flames suspended from the iron chandeliers above were performing a kind of cruelty, making everything look golden and warm and safe when nothing in this room was any of those things. She stood at the top of the marble staircase for exactly 3 heartbeats before anyone noticed her, and in those 3 heartbeats she memorized the exits. Old habit. Older fear. The gown she wore had belonged to her mother. Deep green silk that caught the candlelight like river water at dusk, fitted at the waist with a sash of cream linen, the sleeves long enough to hide the fading bruise on her left wrist. Her dark auburn hair had been coiled and pinned by the innkeeper's wife, who had done it with the careful hands of a woman who understood that sometimes a girl needed to look whole, even when she wasn't. The result was something almost regal, which was precisely the problem, because Ellie was not regal. She was the illegitimate daughter of a dead lord, currently residing in a borrowed room above a tavern in the lower quarter of Ashenvale, and she had received this invitation under circumstances she still did not entirely understand. The letter had arrived 4 days ago. No seal she recognized. The handwriting was formal, precise, slanted left. The hand of someone trained in a scriptorium, not a steward's office. The words had been brief. You are expected at the harvest ball. Come alone. Speak to no one about this. There are things you must see for yourself. She had told herself she wouldn't go. She had put on her mother's gown the morning of the ball. The ballroom below her was filled with the kind of people Ellie had spent most of her 23 years avoiding. Alphas in formal tunics with house crests stitched in silver thread, their betas flanking them like shadows with good posture. Ladies in gowns that cost more than the tavern earned in a season, their perfume, rose and amber and something sharper underneath, musk and power, rising in invisible waves toward the vaulted ceiling. Servants moved through the crowd with silver trays, carrying goblets of spiced wine and small pastries glazed with honey. Somewhere behind the carved wooden screen at the far end of the hall, a quartet of musicians was playing something slow and formal, the melody winding between the conversations like smoke. Ellie descended the stairs with her chin level and her hands loose at her sides, the way her father had taught her before he died. You belong wherever you walk, Eleanor. Walk like it. She hadn't believed him then. She believed him even less now. But the posture remained. She was scanning the room, looking for the person who had sent the letter, looking for a face she recognized, looking for any sign of why she had been summoned here. When she saw them, her stomach dropped before her mind caught up. Lord Cedric Ashmont stood near the fireplace at the east wall, a goblet in one hand, his other resting on the arm of the woman beside him. He was laughing. That particular laugh she knew, the one that crinkled the corner of his eyes and made him look younger than his 31 years, the one she had once believed was reserved for her alone. The woman beside him wore ivory silk. Her hair was pale gold, coiled high, threaded with tiny pearls. She was beautiful in the way expensive things were beautiful. Deliberately, completely, without accident, Lord Cedric Ashmont, who had stood in her father's study 11 months ago and pressed her hand between both of his and said, I will come for you, Ellie. I swear it on my blood, who had written her letters for 6 months after her father's death. Tender letters. Letters she had kept folded inside her mother's Bible. Who had, 2 months ago, simply stopped writing. Who was now leaning down to say something into the ivory-gowned woman's ear, his lips nearly touching her hair. Ellie stood very still in the middle of the ballroom floor. She was good at standing still. She had learned it the same way she had learned most useful things, through necessity, through pain, through the slow understanding that reaction cost more than it was usually worth. So she stood still, and she breathed through her nose, and she watched Lord Cedric Ashmont laugh at something the ivory woman said, and she felt the specific, precise sensation of something she had kept carefully folded inside herself for 11 months come undone at the stitching. She turned away. She needed air or wine. or the mercy of a dark corridor. She wasn't particular. And she was already moving toward the far edge of the room when she heard it. Not a voice. A shift in the energy of the ballroom. A collective subtle alteration in posture, in volume, in the direction of gazes, the way a field of grass all leans the same direction when a predator moves through it. She turned because everyone else turned. He stood at the main entrance, which meant he had not come down the staircase she had used. He had come through the great doors. The Alpha King of Ashenvale, Evander of the Iron Ridge Pack, entered his own ballroom the way storms entered valleys, without announcement, without apology, with the simple, undeniable fact of his presence making all other facts temporarily irrelevant. She had heard descriptions. Everyone had heard descriptions. The Alpha King was spoken of in the lower quarter the way weather was spoken of, as something powerful and impersonal and entirely beyond the reach of ordinary people's preferences. The descriptions had been, she now understood, inadequate. He was tall, in the way that meant his height was the last thing you noticed, because everything else arrived first. Dark hair, cut short at the sides, slightly longer at the crown, with the kind of disorder that was either natural or cultivated, and was dangerous either way. A jaw that looked like it had been constructed for the specific purpose of conveying displeasure. Eyes. She couldn't make out the color from this distance, but the quality of the gaze was unmistakable, the particular stillness of someone who was always watching more than he was being watched. He wore formal black, a tunic with the iron ridge crest at the shoulder in dark silver thread, and he wore it the way the room wore candles, as though it served him, not the other way around. His counsel flanked him, 2 advisors, 3 senior guards in formal uniform. They moved when he moved. He was scanning the room. Ellie looked away. She looked toward the side corridor. She took 3 steps toward it. "Miss Ashford." She stopped. The voice came from her left, low and unhurried, and the use of her name, her real name, the name she had not given to anyone in this room, the name she had carefully omitted from every interaction since arriving in the lower quarter of Ashenvale, sent a cold current from the base of her spine to the back of her skull. She turned slowly. A man stood beside her. Not the king. One of his advisors, older, with the careful eyes of someone who managed complicated things for a living. He was wearing the Iron Ridge colors. He inclined his head, barely. "His Majesty requests a moment of your company," the man said. "At the head table. Now, if you would." It was not a question. It was the shape of a question placed over the frame of a command, which was perhaps worse. Ellie looked toward the side corridor. She looked at the advisor. "I think," she said, keeping her voice level, "there has been a mistake." "There has not," the advisor said, with the patience of a man who had said this before. "Please come." She was seated beside him before she had fully decided to agree to it. That was the most unsettling part. Not the seating itself, not the weight of the entire ballroom's attention turning toward the head table like sunflowers tracking light. Not even the proximity, closer than she had anticipated, close enough that she could detect the particular scent of him. Cold iron and pine resin, and something underneath that her instincts named and her mind immediately refused to examine. No. The most unsettling part was how smoothly it had happened, how the advisor had simply guided her forward, and a chair had been present, and she had sat down because the alternative was causing a scene, which she could not afford. The Alpha King did not look at her immediately. He lifted his goblet. He said something brief to the advisor on his left. He acknowledged, with small precise nods, the greetings of the nobles who approached the head table with the careful performance of casual deference. He was, she realized, extraordinarily good at this, at the management of a room full of powerful people, all of whom wanted something from him, and none of whom he intended to give anything to. Then he turned. His eyes were gray, the precise gray of iron, of winter sky, of stones at the bottom of a cold river. They settled on her face with a quality she could only describe as deliberate, as if looking at her was a decision he had made after consideration, not an accident. "You're braver than I expected," he said. Low, unhurried, not loud enough for anyone beyond her to hear. "I'm sitting at a table," she said. "That requires very little bravery." "You walked into a room where the man who abandoned you is standing next to the woman he's about to announce his betrothal to," he said. "And you did not leave." The words hit her like cold water. She felt them in her sternum, felt her jaw tighten, felt the careful architecture of her composure strain at its joints, and held. She held because she was sitting beside the Alpha King of Ashenvale in a ballroom full of people watching, and she would not give Lord Cedric Ashmont the satisfaction of watching her shatter in public. "You seem," she said carefully, "to know a great deal about my private business." "I know a great deal about most things," he said, without arrogance, simply as a statement of fact, the way one might note the existence of rain. "Including what Ashmont intends to do after the betrothal announcement tonight." He set down his goblet, turned slightly toward her. "Including what he has done to ensure you cannot contest it." She went very still. "What he has done," she repeated. The king's gray eyes held hers steadily. "Your father's will," he said. "The original. The one that named you heir to the Ashford seat and the northern mineral rights. Ashmont has it. He has had it for 8 months. A pause, brief and precise as a blade. He also has the letter your father wrote to the Crown Magistrate the week before he died, the one requesting an investigation into the acquisition of his debt." The ballroom continued around them, music and laughter and the rustle of expensive fabric. Ellie sat at the head table of the Alpha King and felt the floor drop away beneath her feet. "My father died of fever," she said. The words came out smaller than she intended. The king's expression did not change. "I know," he said quietly. And in the way he said it, the weight of it, the stillness, she understood that he was not agreeing with her. He reached for his goblet again, slowly, and leaned back in his chair with the unhurried ease of a man at his own table, and said barely above a murmur, in the tone of someone making a benign social remark to a dinner companion, "We are engaged, for the next 2 hours. Follow my lead, say very little, and when I stand to leave, come with me." Ellie stared at him. "I don't know you," she said. "No," he agreed. "But you know him, and you know what he's done." His gaze moved briefly across the room, toward the fireplace, toward the man with the easy laugh and the ivory-gowned woman on his arm, then back to her, direct and clear. "So, 2 hours." She looked at her hands in her lap, at her mother's green silk, at the fading bruise on her wrist that the long sleeve almost covered. She looked up. 2 hours, she said. The announcement came 40 minutes into the 2 hours. Ellie heard it the way she imagined one heard distant thunder, first as a vibration in the chest, then as something undeniable. Lord Cedric Ashmont stepped to the center of the ballroom floor with the ivory-gowned woman on his arm and a goblet raised high, and the room quieted with the particular obedience that wealth and status commanded. And he spoke of joy, of alliance, of the moon's blessing upon a union long considered and carefully chosen. He did not look toward the head table. The ivory woman, Lady Marin Voss, daughter of the Southern Ridge Alpha, Ellie learned from the murmurs around her, smiled with the practiced grace of someone who had been raised to stand exactly here, in exactly this light, receiving exactly this kind of attention. She was not cruel-looking. That was the worst part. She looked like someone who had simply been handed something that had not been meant for her, and had accepted it without knowing. The applause rose. Crystal goblets were lifted. Somewhere near the east wall, A woman laughed too loudly at something her companion said, the sound cutting briefly above the music before being swallowed again. Ellie sat at the head table with her hands folded in her lap, and her spine perfectly straight, and her face arranged into something that was not quite an expression, and she breathed. She was aware of the AlphaKing beside her, in the way she was aware of the fireplace across the room, as a source of heat that she was deliberately not looking at. She did not need to look. She could feel the steadiness of him, the way his presence generated its own gravity, calm and constant, and entirely unbothered by the spectacle in the center of the floor. "You knew this was going to happen tonight," she said. Not an accusation, an observation, quiet enough for only him. "Yes," he said. "That's why you summoned me. That's one reason." She turned her head to look at him then, for the first time since he had told her they were engaged. He was watching the room with those iron-gray eyes, his expression composed and unreadable, one hand resting loosely on the table beside his goblet. He looked like a man at rest. He looked like a man who was never entirely at rest. "What are the other reasons?" she asked. He did not answer immediately. He had, she was learning, an unhurried relationship with response, as though he considered silence a legitimate part of conversation rather than a gap to be filled. It should have been infuriating. It was, instead, strangely settling, in the way that consistent things could be settling even when they were unexpected. "Later," he said. "That is not an answer." "It is a promise," he said. "There's a difference." The second thing happened an hour into the 2 hours. She had been watching Cedric without meaning to, the way one watched a wound, not with desire but with the grim compulsion to understand the damage, when she noticed the man beside him. Not Lady Marin. The other man, standing just behind Cedric's left shoulder, a narrow figure in dark gray with a house badge she didn't immediately recognize. He was watching the room with the quality of attention that had nothing to do with the celebration happening in it. He was watching specific people, measuring distances. He looked once directly at her. It lasted perhaps 2 heartbeats. Then his gaze moved on. Ellie set down her goblet with more care than the action required. "The man behind Ashmont," she said quietly. "Dark gray, house badge I don't recognize. A silver thread pattern, 2 lines crossing." A pause. Short. "You have sharp eyes," the king said. "Frightened people usually do," she said. "Who is he?" "His name is Renwick. He serves Lord Voss, Lady Marin's father." The king's voice remained level. "He also spent the past 6 years in the employ of a debt collector who operated out of the southern territories, one with a particular specialty." She waited. "Inheritance disputes," the king said. "The kind that get resolved before they reach a magistrate." The music continued. Somewhere nearby, a tray of pastries was offered and declined and offered again. Ellie sat very still and understood, with the slow, terrible clarity of something she had been trying not to understand for 8 months, that her father had not died of fever. She had known it. Some part of her had known it the way the body knows cold, before the mind registers the temperature. The letters that stopped. The debts that appeared from nowhere. The will that the magistrate's office claimed they had never received. She had built careful logical explanations for each of these things, because the alternative, the thing she was now looking directly at, had been too large to carry alone in a borrowed room above a tavern. "How long have you known?" she asked. 7 months, he said. "And you waited until now." "I needed the letter," he said. "The one your father sent to the Crown Magistrate. Without it, nothing else holds legally. I received confirmation of its location 3 days ago." She turned to look at him fully then. The ballroom noise fell away at the edges of her attention. "You have it now?" "My people retrieved it this afternoon." She stared at him, at the absolute steadiness of his face. at the way he was looking back at her, not with pity. She thought she could not have borne pity, not in this moment, not from anyone, but with the clear, direct quality of someone delivering information to a person he considered capable of receiving it. "You could have told me this in a letter," she said. "You didn't need to." She gestured slightly, a small motion that encompassed the ballroom, the gown, the fiction of the engagement, all of it. "Ashmont has had you watched," the king said. "Every letter to you has been opened and resealed. A private meeting would have been reported before it ended." He lifted his goblet, unhurried. "Here, you are beside me. No one in this room moves against someone beside me." She sat with that for a moment. "That's why the engagement story," she said. 2 hours of cover," he said. "Long enough to have this conversation. Long enough for my men to complete what they needed to complete." He paused. "And long enough for you to see it yourself. The announcement, the man behind him. All of it. Why does it matter that I see it?" He looked at her for a moment before answering. "Because in 2 days this goes before the Crown Council," he said. "And the testimony of a woman who witnessed the Ashmont-Voss alliance announced while evidence of murder was being concealed. That testimony matters. You matter." He set down the goblet. "Not as a victim. As a witness. As the Ashford heir." The word heir landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples moving outward and outward. "I'm not recognized as heir," she said. "My father's will. Your father's original will names you sole heir to Ashford lands and the northern mineral rights," the king said. "Ashmont holds a forged copy. The original is now in my custody." His voice remained even, almost quiet, the way very large facts were sometimes delivered by people who had learned that volume added nothing to truth. "You are Ellie Ashford, sole heir to the Ashford seat. That is what you are. That is what they tried to bury." She looked at her hands. She thought about the room above the tavern, the borrowed blanket, the single candle she rationed, the innkeeper's wife who had pinned her hair tonight with gentle hands and hadn't asked any questions, because she understood without asking that some girls arrived in the lower quarter of great cities, with nothing, and with reasons they didn't speak. She thought about her father's face, his hands, large and ink-stained, always ink-stained, the way he had said her name, Eleanor, as though it were something worth saying carefully. She did not cry. She did not have that luxury, not here, not in this room, not with Renwick's eyes having already found her once. Instead, she felt something shift in her chest. Not relief, not yet, but something adjacent to it. Something that felt dangerously like being seen. "What happens after the 2 hours?" she said. "You leave with me," the king said. "My steward has arranged a room in the east wing of the castle. You will be safer there than anywhere else in the city." "I don't know you," she said again. The same words as before, but they meant something slightly different now. "No," he agreed, the same as before. "But you will." Across the room, Cedric Ashmont was accepting congratulations with his easy smile, the ivory woman at his side, Renwick a dark shape just beyond his shoulder. The candles burned on, golden and warm and steady, performing their beautiful, indifferent light. Ellie looked at the king. He was already looking at her, and for a single unguarded moment, she saw something in his expression that wasn't calculation, wasn't strategy, wasn't the careful management of a complicated political situation. It was there and gone before she could name it. She looked away first. 2 hours, she said quietly. It wasn't agreement exactly. It was something more complicated. The decision of a woman who had run out of safe choices and was beginning to understand that the most dangerous thing in this room might also be the only one that wasn't lying to her. The musicians shifted into something slower. The candles burned. Lord Cedric Ashmont laughed his easy laugh. And Ellie Ashford, sole heir to a stolen name, sat beside the Alpha King and waited for the 2 hours to end. When he stood, she stood. She didn't decide to. Her body simply did it, as though some instinct deeper and older than reason had already made the calculation, and found him safer than the alternative. He did not offer his arm. He simply moved, and his advisors fell into position, and the path through the ballroom opened the way paths opened for people who held power. Not because anyone stepped aside willingly, but because no one wanted to be in the way. She walked beside him. She did not look toward the fireplace. She did not look for Cedric. But at the threshold, just before the great doors closed the ballroom behind her, she heard it. A shift in the celebration's rhythm, a small ripple of murmur that moved through the crowd like wind through wheat. They had been seen leaving together. Good, she thought, with a fierceness that surprised her. Let them see. The east wing of Ashenvale Castle smelled of beeswax and old stone, and something faintly herbal. Lavender, she thought, or something close to it. Dried and tucked into the linen of the bed that had been prepared with a care that felt almost aggressive in its thoroughness. A fire burned in the hearth. A tray had been left on the small table near the window. Bread, soft cheese, dried fruit, a clay pot of something warm that turned out to be honeyed broth. A nightgown had been folded at the foot of the bed, plain linen, clean. Ellie stood in the center of the room and looked at all of it, and felt, very precisely, the specific discomfort of being provided for when you had spent 8 months learning to need nothing. The woman who had shown her to the room, a castle servant named Berta, solid and gray-haired, with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had served in large households for decades, had said the king's steward would come in the morning with further information, that she should rest, that the bolt on the door worked from the inside. She had said this last part with the matter-of-fact tone of a woman who understood what it meant to a girl to know a door could be locked from her side. Ellie had bolted it the moment Berta left. Then she had sat on the edge of the bed in her mother's green gown and pressed her palms flat against her thighs and breathed, steadily, until the shaking stopped. It took longer than she would have liked. The shaking had been waiting all evening, politely, persistently, for a private moment. She let it finish. Then she stood, unpinned her hair herself, folded the gown with the careful economy of someone who owned few things she valued, and put on the plain linen nightgown. She ate half the bread and all of the broth. She sat by the fire with her knees drawn up and stared at the flames and thought about her father. Thomas Ashford had been, by any reasonable measure, a quiet man. A scholar before he was a lord, ink-stained and distracted, more comfortable in his library than in any great hall. He had not been powerful. He had not been strategic. He had been honest and stubborn and deeply, consistently kind, and Ellie had loved him with the uncomplicated totality that children loved parents before they understood that parents could be taken. He had died on a Tuesday in early autumn, 11 months ago. Fever, the healer had said. Swift and cruel, the neighbors had said. These things happen, the magistrate's office had said. When she had gone with the will she now understood to have been a forgery, a document substituted somewhere between her father's desk and the official record, and found nothing but closed doors and patient, impenetrable bureaucratic sympathy. She had grieved. She had lost the estate within 6 weeks, the debts appearing from the legal architecture like stones emerging from a receding tide, each one documented, each one apparently legitimate. She had come to Ashenvale because she had nowhere else to go. She had taken the room above the tavern because it was what she could afford. And Cedric, Lord Cedric Ashmont, who had held her hand and sworn on his blood, had stopped writing 2 months into her displacement. And she had told herself that grief made people strange, that distance was difficult, that she should not need consolation so badly. She sat by the fire in Ashenvale Castle and understood now that he had stopped writing because she had become useless to him. The Ashford heir without the Ashford inheritance was simply a girl in a borrowed room, not worth the cost of ink. The anger arrived quietly, the way serious anger usually did. Not as heat, but as something colder and more structural. A rearrangement of something inside her chest. A settling of weight into a new configuration. She recognized it. She had felt it before, briefly, in the days after the estate was taken, before grief had overtaken it. Now grief was no longer at the front. Now there was room for what lived behind it. She wanted the will. She wanted the letter her father had written. She wanted to stand in a hall of law and say, clearly and loudly, what had been done to him, and to her, and to the truth of what he had meant to leave behind. She did not know yet how, but she knew the shape of the want. She banked the fire and went to bed and slept, dreamlessly, for the first time in 8 months. The king's steward arrived in the morning. He was a precise man, perhaps 50, with neat gray hair and the careful posture of someone who managed large amounts of information and found disorder personally offensive. His name was Aldrich. He set a leather satchel on the table where the food tray had been, sat across from her with the permission of a brief, inquiring look, and opened the satchel with the brisk efficiency of someone with a schedule. His Majesty asks that I explain the situation fully, Aldrich said, and answer your questions to the best of my ability. Where is His Majesty? Ellie said. In council. He convened at dawn. Aldrich removed several documents from the satchel and laid them on the table with careful precision. These are copies. The originals are held in the Crown Vault. She leaned forward. The first document was her father's will. She recognized his handwriting immediately. That particular backward slant, the way he formed the letter A with an extra loop, the small, careful signature at the bottom. Thomas Reginald Ashford. Witnessed by 2 names she recognized. His head steward, who had died the following winter, and the village healer, who had vanished from the district within a month of her father's death. She pressed 2 fingers to the signature for a moment. Just a moment. The second document, Aldrich said gently. The second document was a letter. Her father's hand again, but more urgent, the lines less even, written with the particular energy of someone who did not know how much time they had. It was addressed to the Crown Magistrate of Ashenvale. It described, in her father's precise and careful language, a series of financial pressures that had begun approximately 8 months before his death. Debt instruments he had not signed appearing in official records. A creditor he had never met claiming long-standing agreements. His attempts to investigate blocked at every administrative level. His growing suspicion, stated plainly, without dramatics, in the voice of a man who had taught himself to be certain before he spoke, that someone was constructing the legal framework for the dissolution of his estate. He named Lord Cedric Ashmont as a person of interest. He named a debt collector operating out of the Southern Territories, a man called Renwick. Ellie read it twice. She set it down. She looked at the window, narrow, stone-framed, the pale morning light coming through in long, thin bars, and breathed. He knew, she said. He suspected, Aldrich said, with the precision of someone who understood the difference. He was building evidence. He sent this letter 8 days before he died. A pause. It never arrived at the magistrate's office. It was intercepted. By Renwick. We believe so. She looked at the third document. She hadn't touched it yet. What is this one? A record of land title transfers, Aldrich said. The Ashford Northern mineral rights. They were sold 3 months after your father's death to a holding company registered to Lord Voss's family, the same Lord Voss whose daughter is now betrothed to Lord Ashmont. He paused. The sale required a signature from the estate heir. The signature on this document is not yours. She picked it up, found the signature line, looked at the name written there in a hand that made a poor attempt at her own. Eleanor Ashford. They forged my name, she said. Her voice came out flat, which was better than the alternative. Yes, Aldrich said. She set the document down. The council session this morning, she said. What is being presented? His Majesty is presenting the original will and the intercepted letter to the Crown Council, along with evidence of Renwick's movements over the past 3 years. Aldrich folded his hands on the table. He is requesting that Lord Ashmont's house accounts be frozen pending investigation, and that a formal inquiry into the death of Lord Thomas Ashford be opened. An inquiry into the death, she repeated. Yes. That means... It means, Aldrich said, very quietly, that the Crown does not believe your father died of fever. The room was very still. The fire had burned down to embers. In the corridor outside, somewhere distant, she could hear the sound of boots on stone, the muffled exchange of guard rotation, the ordinary morning sounds of a castle that continued regardless. He needs my testimony, she said. It wasn't a question. He does not require it for the inquiry to open, Aldrich said carefully. But your testimony, as the Ashford heir and as a witness to the events of last evening, the announcement, the presence of Renwick, your identification of him, would significantly strengthen the council's case for immediate action rather than prolonged review. She thought about the ballroom, Renwick's eyes finding her across the room, the 2 heartbeats of contact. The quality of that gaze, assessing, cold, the look of a man taking inventory of a problem. She thought about the borrowed room above the tavern, the rationed candle, 8 months of careful smallness. She thought about her father's handwriting, that backward slant, that extra loop on the letter A. When does the council session end? She said. Midday, typically. Tell His Majesty I will give testimony, she said. Tell him... She paused, selecting the words with deliberate care, because words, she had learned, were the one thing she still had full ownership of. Tell him I have things I want said on the record. Aldrich inclined his head. He began gathering the documents back into the satchel with the same neat precision with which he had removed them. One more thing, she said. He looked up. Renwick, she said. Where is he now? Aldrich's expression shifted, barely, a small tightening around the eyes. He left the castle grounds early this morning, he said, before the city gates opened. Her jaw tightened. He knows. He suspects, Aldrich said again, the precision again, which means Lord Ashmont likely knows by now as well. She nodded slowly. Which means the council session this morning is a race. His Majesty is aware of that, Aldrich said. He closed the satchel, stood. He has been aware since dawn. After Aldrich left, Ellie dressed in the clothes Berta had brought, a simple gown, deep brown wool, practical and warm, and sat at the small table and spread her hands flat against the wood and looked at them. Her father's hands had been large and ink-stained. Hers were smaller, and there was no ink, and they were steady. She thought. Cedric Ashmont will stand in a council hall before the day is out, and smile his easy smile and explain everything away. And he will be believed, because men like him are always believed, until they aren't. She thought. I was there last night. I saw Renwick. I can say so under oath. She thought. My father wrote a letter and they buried it. I am still here. I can say what it says. She stood up. She went to the window. The city of Ashenvale spread below her, stone and smoke, and the distant sound of the morning market, ordinary and vast, and entirely indifferent to the specific injustice of one quiet man who had died before he could finish what he started. She pressed her palm flat to the cold stone of the windowsill. I'll finish it, she thought, and meant it in the way that simple things were sometimes the truest. Wholly, quietly, without performance. Renwick was caught on the 3rd day. He had made it as far as the northern road before the king's riders found him, not fleeing precisely, but moving with the particular purposefulness of a man who believed he still had options. He did not, as it turned out. He was brought back to Ashenvale in a covered wagon, under guard, and placed in the castle's lower holding cells, which were cold and quiet, and had the significant advantage of being entirely inaccessible to Lord Cedric Ashmont's remaining allies. Ellie learned this from Aldrich, who delivered information with the same neat efficiency with which he managed everything else. She was in the East Wing library when he told her, a long, narrow room with shelves that reached the ceiling, and a window that faced the inner courtyard, where she had spent the better part of 2 days reading her father's letter so many times that she had memorized it without meaning to. She set the letter down when Aldrich entered. She listened. She nodded. "Does he talk?" she said. "He has begun to," Aldrich said, with the careful tone of someone who knew that begun to covered a great deal of territory. "His testimony implicates Ashmont directly in the interception of your father's letter. It also implicates Lord Voss in the land title transfer, specifically that Voss was aware the signature was forged." She was quiet for a moment. "Lady Marin?" she said. "Does she know?" Aldrich paused. "That is less clear. The inquiry will determine it." She nodded again, and said nothing further on that subject, because Lady Marin Voss was a woman who had perhaps been handed something stolen without knowing its cost, and that was a different kind of tragedy from the one she was occupied with, and she did not have the capacity to carry both at once. "Tell His Majesty I'd like to speak with him," she said, "when he has time." "He anticipated that," Aldrich said. "He asks if this evening would suit. The small council room after the supper hour." She almost smiled. "Tell him it suits." The small council room was exactly that, small, by castle standards, which meant it was merely the size of a generous library rather than a great hall. A fire burned at one end. 2 chairs had been placed near it, angled toward each other rather than toward the table, which she noted as a deliberate choice. A tray with wine and bread had been left on the side table. The room smelled of pine resin and candle smoke, and the particular cold that lived in stone walls regardless of fires. He was already there when she arrived. Standing at the window, looking at the courtyard below, or perhaps at nothing in particular, in the way of people whose minds were always working on something. He turned when she entered, and the firelight did that thing again, the thing she had noticed in the corridor, where it showed details that other light concealed. She sat in one of the chairs. After a moment, he sat in the other. "Renwick is talking," she said. "Yes." "It's enough?" "More than enough," he said. "Ashmont will face full criminal inquiry before the month is out. The forged will, the intercepted letter, the land transfer, and now Renwick's direct testimony placing him at the center of all 3. He paused. "There is also the matter of the healer." She looked at him. "The healer who attended your father in his final days," he said carefully. "The one who left the district within a month of his death. My men found her 3 weeks ago, living under a different name in the eastern province. She has been persuaded to give a formal account of what she was asked to do, and what she did, and what she was paid." The fire crackled. Ellie sat very still. "She administered something," she said. "Not a question." "A compound," he said. "Herbal in origin, untraceable by ordinary means, produces symptoms indistinguishable from rapid fever." He held her gaze with the steady, clear quality she had come to rely upon, the quality that said he would not look away from difficult things, would not soften them into unrecognizable shapes. "I am sorry, Ellie." The use of her name, not Miss Ashford, not a formal address, simply her name in his voice, quiet and direct, did something unexpected to her composure. She had been holding herself very carefully for 3 days, managing the information as it arrived, processing it with the controlled efficiency of someone who knew that falling apart was a luxury with a high cost. The name. Simply her name. caught something she hadn't known was loose. She pressed her lips together. She breathed through her nose. She held. He knew it was coming, she said. He wrote the letter because he knew. Yes, the king said. I believe he did. He tried to protect me. He tried to use the systems that were supposed to protect people like him, and they failed him. She looked at the fire. He died knowing that. He died knowing he had tried, the king said. That is not nothing. She looked at him sharply, not with anger, but with the instinct to dispute comfort, to refuse easy consolation. But his expression held nothing easy about it. He was not offering comfort. He was offering a fact, and he believed it. And she found slowly that she believed it too. Her father had tried. Thomas Ashford, ink-stained and stubborn and deeply kind, had seen what was being done and had refused to simply accept it. He had written the letter. He had named the names. The letter had been buried, but it had survived, and it had found its way eventually to a man who had the power and the will to use it. Her father had thrown a stone into dark water 11 months ago. She was watching the ripples reach the shore. I want to be there, she said. When the formal charges are presented, I want to be in the room. You will be, he said. Not as a witness this time, she said. As the Ashford heir, standing in my own right. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, more like recognition, as though she had confirmed something he had already understood about her. Yes, he said. That is exactly how you will stand. The fire settled. Outside the small window, the night sounds of the castle drifted in. The distant change of the guard, the quiet of a household at rest, the wind moving through the courtyard stones. Ellie looked at her hands in her lap and then looked up. You said there was something else, she said, in the corridor, after the council session. You said later. He was quiet for a moment, the particular kind of quiet she had learned to read not as evasion, but as the gathering of something that mattered. I have been aware of you for longer than 7 months, he said. She waited. Your father corresponded with the Crown Office on several occasions over the years. Boundary surveys, territorial records, the ordinary administrative exchanges between a minor lordship and the central government. His letters were unremarkable in content. He paused. But he sometimes included his daughter's observations. He would mention, in passing, something you had said about the survey records, or a discrepancy you had found in the territorial maps, or an argument you had made about a boundary dispute that he thought showed unusual precision. A brief pause. He was proud of you. It was evident in the way he wrote about you. Not effusively. He was not an effusive man. But clearly. She felt something tighten in her throat. I noticed it, he said simply. Over the years. An absent figure in correspondence. Consistent and particular. Someone worth noticing. He looked at her steadily. When his letter arrived, the last one, the intercepted one, and I read what was being done to him and to you, I already knew who you were. Not as a stranger. As someone I had formed, without intention, a partial understanding of. She was quiet for a long moment. You could have told me that earlier. Earlier you had no reason to trust my motives, he said. Earlier the most important thing was the evidence, and the council and the legal foundation. Everything else, he paused, would have been noise, a distraction from what needed doing. She considered this. She thought about the ballroom, the 2 hours, the way he had delivered information without performance. She thought about the corridor, standing beside her rather than in front. She thought about the word air landing in her chest like a stone into still water. The mate bond, she said. The words came out quieter than she intended. He did not look away. He did not look surprised. Yes. You felt it at the ball. I felt it before the ball, he said, when you walked into the room and stood at the top of the staircase and looked for the exits. The faintest alteration in his voice, something underneath the even surface. Something I had only known abstractly became very specific. She absorbed this. I didn't feel it, she said. And then, because honesty was the only currency she had left that hadn't been stolen. I don't know if I feel it now. I don't know if I trust what I feel. I trusted Cedric's letters, and they were a performance. I trusted the legal system to hold my father's will, and it was subverted. I am not well equipped at present to trust my own perceptions of things that matter. I know, he said. That doesn't trouble you. No, he said. You would be a fool to feel otherwise. You are not a fool. He looked at the fire for a moment. I am not asking you to trust a feeling. I am not asking you to accept a bond because it exists. Those things are not worth having if they are not chosen. He looked back at her. I am asking nothing, Ellie. I want to be clear about that. What I told you is true, and you deserve to know it, and what you do with it is entirely yours. She looked at him for a long time, at the scar along his jaw, at the iron-gray eyes that did not perform patience, but simply had it, at the man who had spent 7 months building a case for a dead lord's daughter while she rationed candles in a borrowed room, who had stood beside her rather than in front of her, who had listed her father's letter among the failures of his own office and meant it. I'm not ready, she said. I know, he said. But I'm not. She stopped, started again. I am not indifferent. Something in his face changed, small and significant, the way light changed when a cloud moved. That's enough, he said. That is more than enough. The formal charges were presented to the Crown Council 6 days later. Ellie stood in the council chamber as Eleanor Ashford, sole and lawful heir to the Ashford seat and the Northern mineral rights, and she gave her full testimony in a clear voice that did not waver, and she watched the legal record correct itself around her father's name, the way a bone set correctly after being long out of joint. Painful in the process, right in the result. Cedric Ashmont did not look easy when the charges were read. He looked like a man discovering that the floor he had built his life upon was someone else's property, and the true owner had come to claim it. Lady Oren read the formal determination in her precise, unhurried voice. Unlawful death, conspiracy to defraud, forgery of legal instruments, theft of hereditary title. The charges against Lord Voss followed, narrower in scope, but no less serious. Renwick's testimony was entered into permanent record. When it was over, the chamber emptied gradually, the council members filing out in the particular ordered quiet of people who had just witnessed something they would discuss for years. Ellie remained in her chair until the room was nearly empty. The king remained as well, at the head of the table, reviewing a document his steward had brought. He did not hover. He did not watch her. He simply remained, in the way she was coming to understand. He simply remained. A constant, undemanding presence that did not require anything of her, and therefore cost nothing to accept. She stood, eventually. She gathered herself. She walked toward the door. Ellie. She turned. He was looking at her from the head of the table, the document set aside. In the clear daylight of the chamber, without candlelight or firelight performing warmth, he looked exactly as he was, a powerful man in a difficult position, steady in it, watching her with the gray eyes that had seen her clearly from the beginning. Your father would have been proud, he said. She held that for a moment. Let it settle into the place where grief and anger had lived together for 11 months, and found that it fit there without crowding either one. That it could exist alongside both. A third thing, warmer. "I know," she said, and meant it finally, without qualification. The Ashford estate was returned to her possession before the first snow fell. She went back in early winter, traveling with a small escort the king had arranged, 4 guards, Berta and Aldrich, who managed the formal transfer of title with the same neat efficiency he brought to everything. The house was cold and had been poorly maintained. Several windows covered with boards where the glass had broken, the garden overgrown, the stables empty. It smelled of damp and disuse, and the particular sadness of a place that had been waiting. She walked through every room. She stood in her father's library and looked at the shelves. Still full. They had taken the money and the land, but not the books. Perhaps because books had seemed worthless to them, which told her everything about what they had valued and what they had not. She ran her fingers along the spines, found the one he had been reading when he died, still marked with a strip of leather at chapter 4. She did not cry in the library. She sat in his chair, and she breathed the cold air of the room, and she let the silence be what it was, not empty, but inhabited, the way places held the shape of the people who had lived in them. She stayed 3 days. Then she went back to Ashenvale. The king was in the inner courtyard when she returned, working with one of his senior guards on a sparring sequence, not performing, simply practicing, with the focused efficiency of a man who maintained his skills, because they were skills worth maintaining. He saw her arrive. He ended the session with a brief word to the guard and crossed the courtyard. He looked at her face. He read whatever was there with his usual precision. "How was it?" he said. "Cold," she said. "Small. Exactly as I remembered." She paused. "I found his bookmark." He understood what that meant. She could see it in his expression. Not pity, but the specific recognition of someone who understood that grief lived in small objects. "Come inside," he said. "There's something I want to show you." She followed him to the council room, not the large one, the small one with the 2 chairs by the fire. The fire was already lit. On the table, carefully laid out, was a set of documents she didn't recognize. "The Northern Mineral Rights," he said. "The formal restoration of the Ashford seat. And," he indicated the 3rd document, "a proposal from the Crown for the management of the Northern Territories, pending your review and decision." She looked at the documents, looked at him. "My decision." "Your lands," he said simply. "Your decision." She picked up the proposal. Read it with the attention her father had taught her to give to legal documents. Slowly, without assumption, following each clause to its consequence. The king sat in the other chair and waited, without impatience, without performance. When she finished, she set it down. "I want to modify Clause 7, she said. He almost smiled. It was not quite a smile, but it was the closest she had seen from him, and it changed his face considerably. "Tell me." She told him. He listened. He asked 2 precise questions. She answered them. They revised the clause together, in the practical, unadorned language of 2 people solving a real problem. And when it was done, she set down the pen and looked at the fire and felt something she had almost forgotten. The specific sensation of being capable, of having competence that was recognized and used, not managed or diminished. "I want to stay in Ashenvale," she said, "while the estate is being restored. I want to be part of the process." She paused. "Not because I need protection." "I know," he said, "because there is still work to do. Voss's accounting, the mineral rights documentation, the formal record of what was done to my father's name." She looked at him. "I want to be here for all of it." "Then be here," he said. She held his gaze. The fire was warm. The room was quiet. Outside, the first snow of winter was beginning to fall. She could hear it in the particular silence that snow brought, the way it softened the edges of sound. "I told you I wasn't indifferent," she said. "You did," he said. "I'm still not ready for, She stopped, revised. "I am ready to stop running from it." He looked at her for a long moment, with those steady iron-gray eyes, and she had the sense that he was being careful with something, that he understood the weight of this moment and had no intention of mishandling it. "Then don't run," he said. "That's all I've ever asked." She nodded slowly. She looked at the documents on the table. Her father's name restored, her name restored, the legal record of what they were and had always been, corrected at last. She looked at the man across from her, who had spent 7 months building the case and never once told her what it cost him, and she thought about stones thrown into dark water, and ripples, and the slow, inevitable arrival of things that were always true. She reached across the small distance between the chairs and placed her hand over his, briefly, deliberately, the way she did everything now, with intention, without performance. He turned his hand and held hers. He did not say anything. He didn't need to. Outside, the snow fell over Ashenvale, gentle and indifferent and covering everything equally. The castle and the city and the road north toward a cold house full of books, where a quiet man had once sat in a library chair and written his daughter's name into correspondence with the careful pride of someone who knew she was worth writing about. The fire burned, the snow fell, and Ellie Ashford, heir to her father's name, witness to his truth, and no longer a girl in a borrowed room, sat beside the Alpha King of Ashenvale and held his hand in the warm quiet of a room that had begun, without announcement, to feel like hers. Lord Cedric Ashmont was formally sentenced before the winter's end, stripped of his title, his accounts dissolved to pay restitution to the Ashford estate, and exiled to the outer territories under permanent restriction. He accepted the sentence in the same composed, slightly aggrieved manner with which he had faced the council, the expression of a man who had always believed his intelligence made him untouchable, discovering too late that it had only made him careful. And careful was not the same as safe. Renwick, whose testimony had been the turning weight of the inquiry, was sentenced separately. He would not be walking free again. Lord Voss faced a lesser charge, complicity rather than conspiracy, and lost the northern mineral rights entirely, which were returned in full to the Ashford estate. Lady Marin, cleared of knowing involvement, dissolved the betrothal quietly and returned to her family. Ellie bore her no ill will. Some people were simply handed things without understanding where they came from. That was its own kind of inheritance. The healer who had administered what killed Thomas Ashford gave her full testimony and disappeared afterward into the kind of obscurity that came from having made a terrible choice, and then, finally, told the truth about it. Ellie did not pursue her further. The truth had been told. The record bore it. That was what she had needed. The Ashford estate was restored over the course of that winter and the spring that followed. The windows reglazed, the garden cleared, the stables restocked. Aldrich managed the paperwork with his customary precision. Berta oversaw the household arrangements with the authority of a woman who regarded disorder as a personal affront. The library, which needed nothing, was left exactly as it was, except that the bookmark was moved to Chapter 5, and then Chapter 6. And then the book was finished and set carefully back on the shelf. Ellie visited when she could, and came back to Ashenvale when the work was there. And over the long quiet months the distance between the two places became a road she knew well, which was its own kind of home. The mate bond declared itself fully on a morning in late spring, not dramatically but simply, like a sentence completing itself after a long pause. She told him the same evening, plainly, without ceremony, because she had learned that the truth said plainly was the only kind worth saying. He listened. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I know." She laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind that surprised her by arriving. He looked at her with that almost smile that had become, over months of proximity, something she thought about with the particular frequency of things that mattered. They married in autumn, in Ashenvale Castle, in a ceremony that was formal and brief, and witnessed by the Crown Council and Berta and Aldrich, and the senior guard who had lost the sparring session the day Ellie returned from the Ashford estate and come back to the courtyard to find the king had gone inside to meet her. The ceremony was followed by a supper that was long and warm and slightly loud, and the candles burned honestly, and no one in the room was performing anything. Evander, AlphaKing of Ashenvale, said his vows in the same quiet, unhurried voice with which he said everything, as though the words were simply true, and therefore did not require volume. He meant them the way he meant everything, completely, without performance, without the possibility of revision. Ellie said hers in the clear, steady voice her father had taught her, and it was done. Not as an ending, as a foundation, which was different. Something built on corrected ground, on a record set right, on the truth of a quiet man who had thrown a letter into the dark and trusted that it would find its way. It had. She had. The candles burned. The snow would come again in its time, and cover everything equally, as it always did. But tonight there was autumn firelight, and the warmth of a room full of people who had chosen to be exactly where they were. And Ellie Ashford, Ellie of Ashenvale, Luna of the Iron Ridge Pack, her father's daughter, and no one's victim, lifted her goblet in the golden light and felt, fully and without reservation, that she had come home.